You can imagine, though, that my education career took off a little bit more than my acting career. It lasted all of 8 weeks. And I'll never forget, I called my parents. I went out of state after this big, long college search. And I said, I want to change majors. And they said, but you did all of your college search to be a theater major. Are you coming back home? And I said, no, I've made friends here. I'm really quite happy. I'm going to stay. And it's because of people like you who, in my high school and in the youth organizations that I was involved in 4-H especially, helped me see the possibilities for my life. And in so many ways, they gave me the reason for what keeps me up inside, my why. So as we go through this presentation today, I'm going to foreshadow the question I want you to think about, which is, what's your why? Now, you've probably heard Simon Sinek ask that question, and you've probably seen a TED Talk about it. But I'm going to break why down into an acronym. What heats you? What heats you up such that you come to work every day ready to make a difference in students' lives? What heats you up on the days when you don't want to go to work and you go to work anyway? Because my hunch is that you have an internal combustion engine that keeps fueling you on those days when something crummy happens. And those days happen. And so I think one of our greatest opportunities is to help students identify what their why is, what heats them up inside. And so the reason why I never finish my slides until the very last moment is because you can always incorporate things from the night before. And just last night, Tricia Seifert talked about helping students identify the problems that they care about in their communities and that they're part of the solution. For me, that is so much about what their why is. And yet, when we talk about higher education, we typically talk about jobs. We don't talk about solving problems. We don't talk about making a difference in the world. We talk about what you're going to do with this degree. And what we know from our colleagues at Georgetown University is that back in 2020, which was all of a year ago, they were already projecting that our future workforce is going to need educated individuals. They posited 35% of all jobs were going to require a bachelor's degree or more, and that 35% were going to require some level of formal education beyond high school. And that those 65% of jobs were particularly going to be needed in 2-year and 4-year degrees, in certificates and credential programs in STEM, just like you heard last night, in healthcare, in community services, including education, and in the skilled trades. So I'm inviting you, when people say, or when students ask, yeah, college isn't for me, I'm not college material, I want to do this, and it's not going to require any education, invite them and help to change their mind that 2-year college isn't college, because it is. It so is. Anyone who's tried to find a plumber, an electrician, a welder knows how difficult finding people that are highly skilled in those trades are to come and fix your plumbing. But I'll tell you, when I had strange water coming up through my bathtub on a Friday night last winter, and we literally bucket brigaded out, I was darn glad I could find a plumber in town. And you probably have the same situation. So we need to help invite students to see themselves as college material in all of those ways. And they are excited to do it. I bet when you're talking with students, you feel their excitement. Here you can see from Instagram and from Reach Higher, these are some young women here in Montana. They are stoked. And during college, you see 1,000 of these posts. You probably post them up on your Gear Up social media pages. It's students, with their pennant, they're psyched. And yet the reality is that we're going to have some amount of loss. Because in the United States, 1 out of 4 students fail to return for even year 2. So let alone, let's not even talk about the 6-year graduation rate. Let's just talk about coming back for the 2nd year. And among those who are in 2-year colleges, that attrition from year 1 to year 2 is even greater. And so it got me thinking, yeah, I've studied a lot about how college affects students, but it's largely the students who've stayed. What about those students who have left after a year, who don't have a good experience, who maybe felt like they never belonged at college, they couldn't figure out how to navigate the space, they were like up to their eyeballs in all of the jargon and the hidden curriculum? What about those students? And then I started to look at these statistics. So if you look at the horizontal bar at 0%, you see a whole lot more underneath, right? All of those bars underneath is from 2015 through 2019, and the consistent reduction in students pursuing post-secondary directly out of high school. Now, we probably all know about fall of 2020. There was a cratering in college enrollment in 2020. In fact, in our 2-year colleges, it was double digits at about 13.5% less than the year before. But if you look over a 5-year span, you see that those numbers are beneath the 0% horizon for 5 years running, which means high school seniors right now are thinking that college isn't for them, that they're not college material. And that's why today I want to say more than anything that what you do today matters more than it did even 15 years ago. Because the opportunity to turn those bars from upside down to the other direction is largely based on the care and the compassion that you show for these students. So if students aren't going to college or aren't pursuing college, where are they? And particularly, where are the young men? Because the young men college enrollment has tanked. And I'm hearing some yeah, because you have seen it. When you look at the data, it is very clear. And so where are our students? Well, I'll tell you, a lot of them play games. And some of them play games for a lot of hours a day. In fact, 97% of teenage boys from a Pew Charitable Foundation poll in 2017 found 97% of teenage boys play games, and 83% of young women reported playing games. So it got me thinking. And it wasn't just from the research. I actually just stopped and started watching my own nephews. I have 4 nephews, bless my sister's heart. She's raising these 4 kids with her spouse, and they game all the time, and they learn all sorts of cool stuff. And so I started thinking, what if we created a game about going to college so that you could learn how to do college rather than feeling like you've been done in by college? And so I started thinking and asking them, how do we go about creating a game? Well, as any good educational researcher, I went straight to the research base and started to learn about games. And I bet, show of hands, how many of you remember the last game you played? Yeah, lots of people. Turn to your neighbors and in 1 minute, say what you remember about that game. What's the last game you remember playing? competition. Awesome. Very cool. So depending on what age you are, you will either remember Phil Donahue walking around and doing this, or you might remember Oprah Winfrey. But I'm going to walk around and invite someone to hold up their hand if you want to share what was the last game you played and what do you remember? So what do you remember about it? Awesome. Awesome. So we're going to come back to this idea that I remember playing it for far too long because that suggests a flow state was found. Who else wants to share? What's the last game you played? Awesome. And one more, I'm going to come over here to Karen.
I was playing Clue, and it was so clueless because I couldn't remember how to play it from before.
There are those moments where you're like, what are the rules again? What's the object of the game? So my hunch is that a huge number of people in this room have played games that they've lost themselves in, that they've lost track of time, that they felt motivated because they wanted to level up. They wanted to keep working to see what was going to happen if they made it to the next level. These are all part of this gamification. How many of you have used Kahoot in the classroom? Yep, that's a huge one. How many of you have used like where you get a math problem right and you get to like throw something, like a basketball thing? Yeah, some people. Anyone play Jeopardy where there's a whole bunch of These are all ways we use commonly known games to make the content that we're learning a little more interesting. It's calling on the competition. There was even some friendly competition in this room just last night with that pitch, right? Who was gonna beat that team from over on that side of the room after their pitch, right? There was that feeling. There are points, there are achievements, there are badges. Anyone play Animal Crossing? Yep. How many people have played because they want to keep thinking, like, what if I get this next level? What if I unveil this next thing? Students are motivated just like we're motivated. But how are we bringing that motivation to our classroom, to our work, to our everyday interactions? You're doing it already. Keep doing it. Because I bet you money if you were to ask students, hey, did you remember more after playing the Kahoot game as we studied for the test versus when we just did regular test prep? They'll tell you something if you listen. That competition excited them. When you give them rewards for doing well, they're motivated. Tisha Richmond has actually gamified her entire family and consumer science class. As students bake better things, they get more rewards, like a special apron with their name on it. These don't have to be huge rewards, but they're enough to motivate. So gamification is on one part of the slide here. The other is actual game-based learning, where the game itself teaches the content. And here is, and actually this is from 1980. This is Sid Meier's Civilization. How many people have played Sid Meier's Civilization? 10 years before the video games, the computer games came out, it started as a board game. And so the game-based learning is when the game itself teaches the content. So in this case, it's teaching about civilization and colonization and moving in to take over a space, right? There's all sorts of, there's World War II games. I remember watching my nephews learn this European history game. Now, I don't think I remembered a thing from European history from high school, but my nephews could go on, and I knew that there was something about it. And so we started thinking. But before, again, like any good researcher, I had to go to the research base and say, so does game-based learning work? Or is it really just fun and games? Because if it's just fun and games, then maybe we just need to place it in that category and acknowledge it for such. But as Willy Wonka says, yes, yes it does. These are what studies have shown game-based learning promotes in students. These are the highlights of outcomes of studies of studies. So meta-analyses is when you take, say, 15 journal articles and you look at each one of them is an aggregate then. And what they're finding is consistently strong positive associations and contributions between those who played games and those who were in a regular sort of traditional classroom on the development of cognitive competencies, including critical thinking, interpersonal competencies, social emotional learning, and college readiness. And so it was this last one that really got me interested, because this is the problem. This is the part of what heats me inside, is helping students realize their potential, so much of which schooling, education is a part of. How can we ensure that those students come back for year 2, and then come back for year 3, and then graduate? Why does it work in a nutshell? It's because it calls upon the things that just naturally make sense. When you give students choice, which is part of self-determination theory, and the autonomy to relate with one another, then they're going to get invested. They're going to get engaged. It's a different situation than when you just talk at students. Why was this room abuzz last night? It was a buzz because our speaker invited us to bring our own choice. Remember, we had a whole list of different problems that we could choose from. Our table went with a totally different problem. That's where games have an opportunity, is because they invite students to be part of the learning environment. And almost always games have a social component, and we lose ourselves. We lose track of time. Before you know it, you're like an hour in, you've figured out how to make 75 three-letter words from a group of 9, and you're thinking, wow, I've got a lot to go on here. And yet we have a couple keys to success, and this is where you come into play. It's not enough for a one and done. The duration by which a student plays a game makes a difference. Because games have a cognitive load. They have a demand to them. You have to first learn the rules of the game. And that almost always takes the first time through. How many people played Catan and knew exactly what to do in the first setting? Anyone? No. I think I understood Catan in the last 5 minutes of the game. And then I was like, oh, that's why duration makes a difference, because to move from games that's just fun and games to learning, you got to invest some time to figure out the strategy. Sound a little bit like life? You got to invest the time to figure out the strategy. And then the second key that the research shows is the supported instruction. That's y'all. This is the good company on a student's journey that helps to make sense of the gameplay, that helps make sense and sense-making of what they just experienced. It's the debriefing. But you know, When you talk about debriefing to teenagers, they glaze over. So I invite you to call yourself a game master and own that you have an opportunity to help scaffold and make sense of this. Because the truth of the matter is, college is a game. There is a hidden curriculum. There is jargon beyond belief. Sonja Ardoin wrote a brilliant dissertation in 2013 titled University Jargon. And you know who finds that jargon the most complicated, the most obtuse to make sense of? The students you work with. First generation college students. Students who are first in their family to walk into those hollowed halls and look around and go, oh my gosh, this is a long way from home. Who all of a sudden are told, hey, you need to go see your advisor. And they have a blank stare. Because what in the world is an advisor? In high school, they're called counselors, right? In fact, from that superhuman high school counselor, once they move into college, that person becomes four. They're often an academic advisor, a student success coach, they're the registrar, and they're the counselor in counseling and psychological services. That superhuman counselor from high school becomes four people when they come to college. How would a first generation student ever know this? Does anyone in this room know what a bursar is? I'll guarantee you not many of our students do because they've never heard that word, but yet it's an important group of people when you think about taking your money, right? How many students don't know what office hours are? I've asked this question of high school students when we're debriefing the game because it's a card as part of the game. And I'm like, I'm curious why no one went to office hours. And the response I've heard is, well, aren't office hours like prep period? And in prep period, you're not supposed to bother your teacher. They're preparing for the next period. Well, you know what? That makes a whole lot of sense. Except in college, office hours is when you're supposed to go see your professor. But if you're taking the knowledge from high school and copy pasting it 3 months later, how in the world would you ever know? And so this is where we started thinking about creating games for college knowledge. And I want to give a huge shout out to my colleagues at the University of Southern California in the Future Bound Games because they met their ed people with their Game Innovation Lab around this sticky problem of helping students get ready for college. And they created this whole suite of games. Future Bound to help middle schoolers. Application Crunch to help navigate the post-secondary application process. Mission at Mission, which is now downloadable, no longer on Facebook. And then Graduate Strike Force. And what they found in their research is that when students played 2 times or more any of these games, their knowledge of how to navigate the college application and financial aid space went up. It differed from their peers who did not play the games. So this got me thinking. In fact, I reached out to Bill Tierney and Zoe Corwin at the University of Southern California, and I told them my idea. And they said, it's a great one. You got to figure out how to do it first and test your ideas, because that is what game design is. Do you remember last night where our speaker talked about prototyping, ideating, throwing all the ideas out there? That's what game development does. It asks you to come up with all the possible ideas. And so some other ideas that have been generated is this higher ed transition game. And I just spoke to the gentleman at Ferris State from their game development program, Andrew Peterson, and he created Enrolled as part of his dissertation research. It's available on the Game Crafter. It's used in higher education institutions in their first year seminar. And he said to me, why would we not want to have the best learning environment for our students? Just earlier you were saying, we know what works. We know that just simply talking at students is not going to make the difference. How do we engage them in the discussion? Well, this is how. We stop as adults thinking we know all the answers, and we invite students to come up with the solutions. And so literally yesterday, I'm driving, and not while I was driving. I was at a rest stop, and I pulled out my phone, and I looked at LinkedIn, and right there, Matthew Farber, professor at the University of Northern Colorado, had just posted about a game jam that they hosted for first-generation college students to make games about the challenges that they were having in their first semester navigating a new space, how to navigate the college environment. Because when you talk to students, they often talk about how opaque it is. You know, it's like you can't quite see through. This is in the shadow for whatever reason, but these drawings up there in the top right-hand corner are from my nephews. That one Christmas when I said, I have this idea, but I don't know how to bring it to fruition. I had no earthly knowledge that I was going to co-opt our entire Christmas holiday and have my nephews drawing and brainstorming, ideating for 4 days. But that's exactly what they did. They kept saying, Aunt Trish, I think your game needs to do this. And you can be part of a house, you know, kind of like Harry Potter, or maybe that's associated with your major, and you want to recruit the coolest faculty members to be part of your club. I mean, imagine a 13-year-old going on and on. These were their ideas. So I was so motivated that Christmas. I came home, I came back to Montana State, and I had all these drawings. And I had all this content knowledge of like how college works and how mysterious it is for first generation college students to navigate. And I met these young students at the MSU Launchpad, Branson Faustini and Waylon Roberts. And they said, you know what? You're onto something. They were venture coaches at our Launchpad. And they're like, we like your idea. Right now it's kind of a little rough around the edges. Can we help you? And so they formed a small LLC so we could hire them. And Magic Sail Games was born. And before you knew it, Success Prince Crash Course started making the first 1,000-mile loop as we prototyped. You have on your desks or on your tables a couple of the different versions of the game that we've now created. We have a common version that we joke is set at the mythical tabletop university. And this is really used in high schools because it is of a mythical place that highlights the programs and services, the common college culture that you would find at anywhere university or at tabletop university. This is 4 young men up in Ritchie, Montana. Ritchie is a very small community up in the northeast corner. And what's interesting to me is when I come into high schools, sometimes the teacher will say to me, now that group over there, it's almost always young men, that group over there, they're tough to engage. So I'm just letting you know. Dollars for Donuts, they are the most competitive and are working to win every time. It is so fascinating to see young people, when you give them a chance to learn in a different way, how they gravitate. Then we have these custom versions. And over here on your table, feel free to look at it, as I think Montana Tech, Montana State is over here in the middle. And these custom versions tell the story of a unique campus, of a particular place. For example, the welding assignment card you wouldn't find at just any university, but there is a 2-year college associated with Montana Technological University, and it was important to have that part of the flavor. Again, not every university would take first-year students on an underground mine tour. But if you're in Butte, Montana, you sure as heck might go on the underground mine tour. In a nutshell, this is the formula for college success. You have to bring your GPA plus your social minus the stress that you're carrying and minus whatever shortfall you have on cash. That pretty much nails it. Players who have lots of GPA and no social really struggle, right? When things start to fall apart because they don't have anyone to turn to. Their stress then tends to go up, even if they have a lot of cash. They're just not in a good balance. Players who have a lot of social points and not much GPA, it doesn't matter about their stress or their cash, I'll tell you. Lots of social, no GPA, what is that called? Dropout, academic suspension, any of those things. So the game gives players a chance to test their strategy for college success before the consequences are real. Feel free to go around. I want to also point out that a huge part of the game is around friendships and making friends and managing your social network. You'll notice that in the bottom left-hand corner, it's something that's called upkeep. Upkeep is the relationship maintenance cost of having that person in your social network. Now, it's interesting when we play in rural schools, this is so fascinating to me because many of the kids in really rural communities have no memory of ever consciously making a friend. Because they have always gone to school with the same group of kids their whole life. And so the notion that you would have friends with different kinds of upkeep, they see Leah there in the middle on the left-hand side, and they're like, she costs cash. What does that mean? I don't need to buy my friends. And I always say, no, she's the kind of friend who always wants to go out. She wants pizza today and ice cream tomorrow, maybe a coffee date down the next week. If you don't have money to hang with Leah, you're probably not going to maintain her friendship. My other favorite are the friends that in the bottom left-hand corner, you see it says counts as one stress. There is always a chuckle in the high schools, counts as one stress. The best part is when a student says, I don't get it. What does that mean? In which case I always say, well, does it mean that you don't have any friends in your life that are kind of stressful? Oh. And the ones who look at you like you have no idea, they're the stressful friends. Invariably, they're the stressful friends. I want to point out also that all of our friends have different superpowers. And so part of this social network is figuring out how are you balancing both the upkeep of your friendships and having friends who have superpowers that support your goals. Because there's lots of friends you could have that don't do that. And so the game gives students a chance to think through these questions. I also want to pick up on something Justin said last night. You cannot be what you cannot see. And so we very intentionally, and all of this artwork was done by students. Every phrase, the flavor text was written by students. I literally worked on grammar to make sure that things made sense. That was like my contribution. But we really wanted to ensure that the diversity of today's college students was represented in the cards. And I'll never forget when I was in Havre, Montana, and a young African-American junior, I think, said, look, there's a brother on these cards. And he was pointing out Professor Huff, who's an investment professor. And Professor Huff's superpower is that he's going to help you to make wise investments so that you really understand investment strategy, and it's going to bump up your finance GPA. So I think that there's a lot of different pieces that games can provide, right? There are some games that are really simple. Angry Birds is one of those kinds of games. It's something to do. But then there are strategy games. And what I think that students enjoy the most about this is that it is just at the pitching over the edge of cognitive demand. You have to figure out how to use your limited blocks of time to meet that formula for college success across all of the campus resources, spending time in class, spending time in work, maybe spending time in a hobby. You get to choose how you're going to elect to spend your time. We also introduce events. This is how you make friends, is by getting out and actually meeting people, spending enough time to make a friend. I told this story last night, but what's so interesting to me through the game prototyping and play testing is when I'm playing with actual college students, how often they will say, I'm playing this game just the way I'm playing life. I'm like, oh, tell me about that. So this young woman at Montana State in their first year seminar program says to me, in this game, I'm doing really well academically, but I have no social points and I have no friends. And this was in that debriefing game mastering moment. And I said, well, in the game, what would you have to do differently? She's like, I would have to choose to spend my time going to those social events. I'd have to choose to be out there and try to meet someone. And so then I said, well, if you were to do this in real life, what would you need to do differently? And she said, I'd have to choose to spend my time to leave my residence hall. I would have to choose to go out and take advantage of some of the social events on campus. And so what I find fascinating is how closely games can model real life and can be a chance for students to think about the strategies of how they're going to use them. From my own research, and probably I bet you've heard something similar, students are stressed about picking a major. How many of you have heard students stressed out about choosing a major? Yeah, totally. The game has assignments based on different meta majors. And those meta majors allow students to start to see what kinds of things does a STEM degree really entail. Because if you've never met anyone who is actually a scientist or an engineer from your small town or your urban community, it might be hard to envision yourself doing this assignment. Or you're in your first year class and you look at the assignment and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't do that. This gives students a chance to learn about these as things happen. And just like in real life, by week 3, the bloom is off the rose and life happens. And life is good, bad, awful, and awesome. And depending on what card you get, you have to respond to whether you have a student discount and you just got some more cash in pocket. That's pretty awesome. Or if you're late to class because you're stuck in traffic and you've just lost 3 study points, what are you going to do? I remember last night, one of the pieces, those 3 words that Justin talked about, in addition to personal brand, was adapt and learn. And this is part of that adapt and learn. When you have life happens to you, you have to figure out what you're going to do. And what's fascinating is how student players learn this. So the very first trip I did during COVID, I was in a high school up on the High Line, which is really northeastern Montana, small town on the Fort Peck Reservation. And this group of 7th grade girls drew the concussion card. Well, the panic attack. The panic attack card. And it comes with 3 stress points. And wouldn't you know that in 2 turns, those young women had made choices around their time to relieve all of their stress and to be back at net zero. They had figured out, hey, so I have a panic attack. I should go take advantage of the counseling that's available on campus. I should probably go and spend some time in a hobby. They can figure out how to adapt and learn. And one of the things that I absolutely love is when we draw the group assignment. How many of you loved group assignments? You're like, yes! Yeah, crickets. There was one. I saw one person. The group assignment is a great chance for students to actually learn how do you talk about how much time you're going to put in on a group assignment so that people know. And no one is the slacker. No one's carrying everyone else's weight, but you can have an upfront conversation about how well you want to do. The game starts to develop those skills in players. We're working on a digital game. It's in development. And it's going to be so exciting because it takes all of the systems in terms of GPA and social and friends and wellness, and it moves it into that digital space. But the other thing that's really exciting is that it allows for a deeper exploration in terms of majors and careers. So we have a module being developed that will introduce students to typical things you would do in welding. Because welding is one of those really interesting areas that is a 2-year college major and is a class in a whole host of 4-year degree programs. There isn't an agriculture major around that doesn't have to take a welding class because you sure as heck need to figure out how you're going to take care of things on your farm or ranch. The impact we've had so far has been really, this is the reason why I do it. It's the reason why I'm getting ready for this 1,600-mile road trip. It's visiting with young people in their high school and middle school classrooms. Now, this game launched 4 months before the pandemic shut down the whole world. So imagine you have pilot tested, you've prototyped, you've toured, you've developed, you've figured out how to manufacture a game, because that wasn't ever your intention. It was all about building a video game, and then someone says, hey, how do I get a copy of this board game? And you find a game manufacturer here in the United States, and then the manufacturer closes down. No one's going to work. There's no schools that have students gathered around a table to play a board game. And so what I'm going to share with you in the breakout sessions this afternoon is talk about adapting and learning. We've figured out how to pivot gameplay from around a table to such that we can project the game board and that you, in a socially distant space, can make your play on your personal game board right in front of you. And that's what you see that young woman on the left-hand side doing. We've played in first-year seminar programs and outreach programs in colleges. This is a picture at Montana State University in one of their engineering outreach programs. We trained their peer leaders to be game masters, and then they facilitated all of these different tables. And we had like 11 tables going with high school students playing along with a college student. We're playing in South Africa down there in the right-hand side with first-year international students, as well as in first-generation college students. And what's interesting to me is that in this international gameplay, the stories, what we've heard from students, sound so similar. So the orange dot, the orange star is here, Montana. And you can see a sophomore saying, the story on these cards is so fun. I love that they don't shy away from more mature topics. We don't treat students like babies, right? Because in 3 months, they're going to be in college and they're going to have to decide how they're going to spend their time and if they're going to go to that party and how they're going to handle it. But then we go to London. This is my friend Kirsty Wadsley of the London School of Economics. And Kirsty met me at a conference before the game even existed. It was like just in an idea phase. And she came up afterwards and said, I need your game. I know that you work with really rural students in Montana, and I work with students in downtown, hyper-urban London, but I think we find the same challenges. And so this is one of their summer school students, a little too realistic. This is my friend Constance Krupi in Johannesburg, South Africa. And you can see here, invest more time on studying and choose friends that will help you reach your goal. Students can learn from games. It doesn't have to just be fun. It can be highly informational. This is now in Australia, outside of Sydney. The game is a creative way in getting prepared for university life by having common scenarios to manage. From a high school teacher, I'll never forget this. A high school student, a sophomore boy, who had so much fun, he left the room and went and got his family consumer science teacher and said, Miss Chinito, we just played this game and it's so much fun. I think you need to have it in your class. When you have students talk about games, and that's what happens when we move content to learning spaces, they have a different experience. It's going to take something to get high marks. You have to make choices about your time. It doesn't just happen overnight. And it's all part of balance. That's that formula, again, for success. It's the preparation. And so my takeaways as an educator in doing this with students, for students, at every turn, and I think that these are takeaways that may resonate with you, is to listen to your students. They have remarkable ideas. They can tell us where the fault lines are, where the challenges reside. We can learn from them. In fact, we can invite them to teach us, because they often have so much wisdom if we're quiet enough and willing to learn. And then together, we can lead with them. And so while I say that I'm out on this 1,600-mile journey where the next phase will be going back to so many of those same exact small rural schools where we prototyped, to now collect the data around how gameplay promotes college readiness, I don't drive alone. I don't travel by myself, because all of the students that have been part of this journey, Waylon and Bran and Austin, Travis, they are all with me, and they continue. And so I invite you to think, how is it that what heats you is that combustible engine that keeps you firing you up? Because for me, it's figuring out how we can use games and other interactive and engaging mechanisms to promote students to say, yep, I am college material. I can do this. I will do this. And then I may choose to return home to my home community and make a difference there as well. I just want to thank you so much for the opportunity. Gear Up means an enormous amount to me. I was a rural kid who dreamt about college from 5th grade. I watched The Facts of Life all the time. I just knew that I could do it, but I wasn't sure how. And it was because, like I said at the beginning, it was people in youth programs, youth organizations. Gear Up wasn't in my town, but I knew I had good adults who would be good company on my journey. And that's honestly what I think we are. At our very best moments, it's about being good company on those students' journeys, because they have the choice, they have their own internal combustion engine, and they're ready to launch. Thank you so very much. I'm happy to take whatever questions you might have. Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. So once they opened up the manufacturing again, I ordered an entire inventory. And so I'm just a small business person who has games in her basement. And when orders come in, I package them and I send them out through USPS. So that it's immediate. In fact, I actually have some with me. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the game is a 4-person game. You could play it anywhere between 2 to 4. I would say that I've had the best fun when I play with teams of 2 So it will be like 8 students around a game board. Like anything, the first time you play, it's the longest. So I would say in a 50-minute class period, we typically make it through midterms. I have a YouTube channel that walks through the rules so that can speed it up a lot. And I'll be honest, the students I've played with pick it up a lot faster than the adults. Every single time. Once you've played the first time through and your students understand the flow, you can play an entire 9 weeks in a 50-minute class period. Yeah. The other thing that I always say with the game duration is that the first week is slow when you're playing, and the second week is slow. And the analog, and you don't really know what you're doing, you're still figuring it out. And the analog is that's just like college. The first week in college, you're probably wandering around looking at, now is this the brick building I go in, or is that the brick building I go in, right? So there's a lot of opportunities for the game master to say, if you're feeling like this is confusing, wait till week 3, because it starts to make sense. And it starts to make sense in real life, too. Yeah.
You mentioned like peaks and high and flow theory, and then Vygotsky and scaffolding. What are some ways you incorporated that in your game?
Thank you. So the flow theory is, I think we're going to see that more as we move into the digital game, right? Where there is not a finite amount of time. There isn't an end. You can actually just keep playing. You can keep exploring different majors and so forth. But the Vygotsky, the scaffolding, that's really in part where the game master comes in, right? So you just turn students loose to play this game? Absolutely. I would have a copy in the library, and it would just give those students who are like, I don't have anything to do, at least something to do, right? The learning piece, though, is to have the game master. More interesting is the learning in the pairs. When you have this group, I was playing in Australia a couple years ago, pre-COVID, and I'll never forget this pair of 2 young men decided to do something I thought was very ill-advised. They went all in on this big scholarship that was going to give them full tuition. So they put in a lot of time for the scholarship application. They won the scholarship, but the requirement was that they were going to need to have 15 GPA points at the end of the game in order to collect on it. And I took a look at their GPA at that point, and I was like, this is not smart. There is just not any. What happened? They had strategized that this was what they were going to do, and they made all of their choices henceforth to earn that GPA because they were motivated to get the scholarship. It made all these other choices. They didn't have to work so much because they knew if they spent the time on their assignments as often as they came up, that they were going to get the GPA points. That happened in near-peer scaffolding and conversation. It was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, was that learning. Yeah, other questions? If you're interested in playing, I am actually doing 2 play sessions. Part of why I walked through so much of the game was to give you a sense of how play works. I'm going to be doing that, the projected game screens, and you'll have personal game boards with game tokens as pennies. We're going to be playing in the next 2 breakout sessions, and I have 2 different versions. We'll play one session with the Montana State University custom version, and the other session with the traditional set at Tabletop University. So you can get a sense of what gameplay is like and compete against your colleagues. Thank you so much again for the opportunity to share with you.